Somebody lived in that house for 4 days after the murders, slept there, ate the family's bread, fed their cattle every morning like it was nothing. And the 6 people they had killed were lying less than 100 feet away the entire time. When the bodies were finally found in a barn in rural Bavaria, one of the men who found them did something that still doesn't sit right 100 years later. While the 2 neighbors beside him stood frozen at the door, he walked past them into the farmhouse alone. He unlocked a door nobody had given him a key to, in a house where a killer, for all he knew, could still be waiting. And he went straight for one specific room, looking for one specific child. A 2-year-old boy he had never once legally called his own. His name was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He was never arrested, never charged. He spent the rest of his life suing anyone who dared say out loud what half the village already believed. And to this day, nobody can prove he did it or prove that he didn't. That single walk into that farmhouse is just one thread in a case built almost entirely out of things that don't add up. A family with a secret they'd been convicted of in open court. Footprints in the snow that walked in and never walked back out. A newspaper nobody remembers buying. And an ending that investigators, even using modern forensics decades later, still refuse to say out loud. This is the story of Hinterkaifeck, and by the end of it, you'll understand why the people closest to solving it chose to keep the answer to themselves. 6 people lived at Hinterkaifeck, a farmstead in the quiet hill country of Bavaria, about 70 kilometers north of Munich. Andreas Gruber, 63, owned the land. His wife, Kazelia, was 72. Their daughter, Victoria, 35, widowed by the First World War, lived there with her 2 children, 7-year-old Kazelia and a 2-year-old boy named Joseph. A new maid, Maria Baumgartner, 44, had arrived to work for the family less than a day earlier. On paper, it looked like an ordinary rural household. It wasn't. 7 years before the murders, a Bavarian court had convicted 2 people in this house of a crime most families never speak of at all. Andreas and his own daughter, Victoria, found guilty of an incestuous relationship. Andreas served a year in prison for it. And when Victoria gave birth again, in 1919, to the boy named Joseph, she told a neighbor, quietly, privately, exactly who she believed the father was. Not the man she'd later fall in love with. Her own father, again. That neighbor's name was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He reported it. Andreas was arrested a second time, and somehow the courts let him go again, while Schlittenbauer, of all people, agreed to informally raise the boy as his own. Everyone in the surrounding villages had a theory about what was really happening behind Hinterkaifeck's walls. Almost none of them said it out loud. And in a matter of weeks, all of them would be dead. Everyone who might have known the truth, gone in a single night. In the weeks before the murders, the family began noticing things. Andreas found a newspaper on the property that no one remembered buying, and no one nearby subscribed to it. Then he found footprints, fresh ones, in the snow, leading out of the forest and straight to the door of the farm's machine shed, whose lock had been broken for weeks. He followed them to the door, and that's where they ended. No prints led back into the trees. He searched the shed. He searched the barn. He searched the house. He found nobody. That same period, the family started hearing footsteps in the attic at night. The same complaint a previous maid had made 6 months earlier, before she quit and refused to come back. Andreas told his neighbors about all of it, and every time they offered to help, he said no. He never reported any of it to the police. On the afternoon of March 31st, 1922, Maria Baumgartner arrived to begin her new job. Her sister walked her there and left soon after. By that evening, Maria had been on the farm for less than 12 hours. That same night, someone lured Andreas, Kazelia, Victoria, and young Kazelia out to the barn, one at a time, and killed each of them with a mattock, a heavy farm tool used for breaking ground. Investigators later determined something important. The barn was too far from the house for its sounds to carry. Whatever drew 4 people out into the dark that night, one after another, it wasn't noise from frightened animals. Someone convinced them to come outside. Then the killer went back into the house. 2-year-old Joseph was murdered in his bassinet. Maria Baumgartner was killed in her bedroom on her first and only night in the household. 6 people were dead, and the person responsible did not leave. For the next 3 or 4 days, someone stayed on that farm. They fed the cattle. They ate the family's bread, cut meat from the pantry, and lit the kitchen fire, while 6 bodies lay exactly where they'd fallen, just on the other side of the wall. Nobody came looking right away. Coffee sellers stopped by the next morning, knocked, got no answer, and left. But somebody was watching them leave. Late that same night, a farmer walking home saw 2 figures standing at the tree line near the farm. And the moment they realized he'd spotted them, they turned away, just enough to keep their faces hidden. The following night, a traveling craftsman named Michael Plockle walked past the property and saw smoke rising from the chimney. Somebody was still in there. He hadn't taken 2 more steps before a figure stepped out of the dark and shone a lantern straight into his eyes, blinding him on the spot, long enough for him to lose sight of who was holding it. He said afterward that the smoke smelled wrong. Nobody ever went back to find out what had been burning in that oven. Not that week. Not ever. The days kept passing, and nobody thought to ask why. The family missed church that Sunday. The 7-year-old missed school, with no explanation sent to her teacher. A mechanic arrived to fix a farm engine, waited an hour for Andreas to show up, heard nothing but a howling dog and restless cattle, and finished the repair by himself, never once wondering why a farm this size had gone completely silent. It wasn't until that afternoon, 4 days after the murders, that Schlittenbauer sent 2 boys to check on the family. When they came back with nothing to report, he went himself with 2 other neighbors. They found the doors locked. They broke in through a gate, and in the barn, they found 4 bodies stacked together. That's when Schlittenbauer walked into the house alone. He said afterward that he'd gone and looking for Joseph. Inside, he found the boy dead in his bassinet, and Maria Baumgartner dead in her room. He had disturbed the scene before police ever arrived, and he wasn't the only one. By the time investigators from Munich got there, villagers had already walked through the property, moved the bodies, and, remarkably, cooked meals in the same kitchen the killer had used days earlier. Whatever evidence had survived the killer's 4 days on the farm didn't survive the crowd that followed. An autopsy the next day turned up a detail that's hard to sit with. Young Kazelia hadn't died right away. She'd been alive afterward, lying in the barn straw, long enough to tear clumps of her own hair out. Investigators first suspected robbery. They questioned traveling laborers and vagrants from nearby villages. Then they found a significant amount of money still inside the house, untouched, and that theory collapsed. Whoever had lived on this farm for 4 days, cooking in its kitchen and feeding its animals, had walked past that money and left it exactly where it was. The murder weapon itself wasn't even at the scene. It surfaced almost a year later, when the farmhouse was torn down, the mattock, still stained with blood, hidden in the loft above the kitchen. A farmhand named Georg Siegel later told police he'd carved that Maddox handled himself, and that he knew exactly where it was normally kept. Someone else knew that too. Suspicion never left Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He'd had a documented, bitter history with Andreas Gruber. He was widely believed in the village to be Joseph's real father, whatever Victoria had privately claimed. A household key had gone missing days before the murders, and some wondered whether Victoria had given it to him. And in 1925, visiting the ruins of the demolished farm, he made an offhand comment about how the killer's attempt to bury the family in the barn had been slowed by frozen ground, a detail that sounded to some like something only the person who'd been standing there that winter would know. He was never charged. He denied it for the rest of his life and successfully sued the people who called him a murderer to his face. He wasn't the only name investigators followed, and some of the others are just as strange. Victoria's husband had officially died on a battlefield in 1914. His body was never recovered. Decades later, a rumor started that he'd actually survived, deserted, and come home to finish something, until two men who served beside him came forward and swore they'd personally identified his body themselves. Years after that, a dying woman confessed on her deathbed that it was her own brothers who'd done it. Men tied to a violent paramilitary group with blood already on their hands from a separate massacre. One of them was questioned, held, then released. The case against him quietly dropped for lack of proof. A former maid who'd once worked at Hinterkaifeck named still more men, describing a stranger she'd spoken to through her window on the very night of the murders. Every one of these leads was followed. Every one of them went nowhere. In 2007, a group of police academy students reopened the case files using modern investigative methods. They praised the original detectives for their thoroughness and criticized them for one glaring failure. In an era when fingerprinting was already standard practice, nobody at Hinterkaifeck ever took a single print. Every one of those students, working independently, arrived at the same conclusion about who was most likely responsible. They have never released the name. Out of respect, they said, for the people still living who share it. The case was formally closed in 1955. The last known interrogation took place in 1986. And the questions that mattered most in April of 1922 are the same ones that remain today. Who was watching that farm from the tree line in the weeks before the murders? Why the killer stayed instead of running? What was burning in that oven while a man stood in the dark and blinded a passersby with a lantern rather than let himself be seen? Somewhere in a small Bavarian farming town, a family is still living under a name that a room full of investigators once agreed on and never spoke aloud.